Constructive Thinking is a podcast by the Progressive Contractors Association of Canada. My name is Karen Rinkema, and I am the Vice President for Ontario for PCA. Today, we will be talking with my colleague, Stephen Hamilton, our Director of Public Affairs, on a new consultation the Ontario government has launched on apprenticeship and procurement. This program was taped on January 9th, 2026. I hope you enjoy. Stephen, Happy New Year. Nice to do this together at the beginning of the new year. We are talking about a consultation that the government let out. I'll use the word let out, but I would say released, maybe is a better word, right before Christmas. 30 days for stakeholders to respond over the Christmas break. Not a surprise that the consultation came out. They had announced in the spring budget of 2025 that they were going to consult with the industry on how to put requirements around apprenticeship quotas in public procurement. So, Stephen, why don't you just give us a little bit of a background on this consultation? Who's doing the consultation? What does a consultation mean? Maybe just kind of a context for the process of this consultation. Then we'll get into kind of the meat and potatoes of what the consultation means.
Sure. So the consultation, it was released, as you said, in early December 2025. It's released by the Ministry of Labour, Immigration, Training and Skills Development. We were anticipating this. This was mentioned in budget documents in 2025. So it wasn't a complete surprise to us. The consultation itself, the questions, again, nothing too surprising in it, and we'll get into that, I'm sure. But the purpose of it was for the government, and I'm reading their language here, to increase training and job opportunities for more apprentices on public infrastructure projects. So they want to increase apprenticeship registrations, they want to increase apprenticeship completions, and they want to use public procurement as a means to do that. And so PCA will be responding, we'll get into that, but there's a lot of interest amongst the stakeholder community, both on the employer side, industry side, as well as organized labor.
Yeah, obviously the idea around this or what prompted it was a few stakeholders probably suggesting to the government that this was public procurement was a vehicle in which to increase apprenticeship. And so the government provided consultation, and the language in the spring budget was in response to probably a small group of stakeholders asking for this to exist. Not a new idea, Stephen. Like this idea around using public procurement or public tenders to force certain actions of the construction community. But this specific topic, actually, this is not new. Let's go back all the way to 2013 under the previous government, in which Bill 6 was introduced. And in Bill 6, again, it contemplated using all public procurement as the vehicle to force contractors to hire apprentices. Not a bad idea on the surface of it. Sounds great. But why don't we kind of dig in a little bit here to, where probably some of the hiccups were back in 2013 and the responses that happened. By 2014, by the time the bill passed, the bill had been amended a little bit, and it said, okay, well, the government has been given regulation-making authority around using public procurement as the vehicle to increase apprenticeship. Regulations were never established all the way fast forward to 2018 to a new government. Never actually saw the regulations from that bill. They did have a couple test pilot projects to arguing little success. But why don't we dig into what we think are, what some of the flaws are just generally around the idea of using public procurement to force, I'm going to say force, because I think the idea of increasing apprenticeship is good, but the idea of using public procurement and stipulating a certain number in public procurement to increase apprenticeship across the board, not just apprentices and compulsory trades, is problematic. So why don't we dig into that a little bit, and then maybe you can talk about some of the things that have already gone right that this government's done.
Sure. Yeah, as you mentioned, it's not a new idea. This has been floated for some time. The previous government backed down from this proposal. It is a dramatic policy proposal if you take a step back. The billions of dollars the province spends every year, obviously they want to get, number one, the best bang for their buck, hopefully, and they want to get the jobs done on time as well. With this proposal, they've contemplated two different concepts. The first is establishing minimum requirements, which, as you mentioned, that would be kind of like a quota. So if you're an electrical contractor, they might require 10 to 20% of the workers on the job site to be registered apprentices. That, again, the way this proposal is written, there's no distinction between a voluntary trade where an apprenticeship is optional and a compulsory trade like plumbing, electrical, where an apprenticeship is required to do the work, and then you get a C of Q. So that's concerning first off. The second concept is a little lighter, called evaluation criteria scoring. And that approach is adding evaluation criteria to existing procurement processes and awarding extra points to bidders who support apprenticeship. So again, that is, I guess, a lighter touch than the quota system, but certainly it's placing the thumb on the scale of procurement towards certain outcomes. Again, as you mentioned, there's nothing wrong. We agree with the government's suggestion that we want to increase apprenticeship. We're not arguing that, and I don't think any stakeholder is arguing that. But it's problematic for a number of reasons, and we can go through them. Number one, it implies that companies aren't already maximizing the number of apprentices that they can. Companies, generally speaking, for most trades, are trying to hire as many apprentices as they can to train a new workforce. Obviously, from a cost standpoint, they're on paper cheaper. Obviously, they're not cheaper because they require a lot more supervision. But the suggestion that there is just this spare capacity within industry, if only there was more regulation to compel business to hire apprentices, we think like that's not what we're hearing from our members. That's not the reason why apprenticeship numbers, first off, they're not low. They've gone up significantly over the past few years, but that's not necessarily going to move the needle. The second thing is we're concerned that the way companies operate, they're there to maximize productivity on the site. And that's across the board, within the confines of their collective agreement, potentially, or within the confines of other regulations. But they're there to maximize it for the taxpayer in the case of public procurement. And when you do this, you're changing the way a company will manage its job site. And again, some job sites, they might already be hitting, they likely are for a lot of, especially in the compulsory trades, hitting those numbers. But they're certainly not in the voluntary side. We can get into that. But the fact that you would have such a heavy hand forcing a percentage of your workers to be apprentices does certainly change the dynamic on the job site. And not all job sites are the same. As folks that are listening to this that are in construction, there are some very complicated projects where you wouldn't have the same number of apprentices as maybe a more simple project where there's compulsory trades. Yeah,
and so just to interrupt really quickly, I think the proposal on suggesting that you need to, let's say it's 10 to 20% of apprentices on any which job site, is assuming that A, all job sites are equal, and B, that all apprentices are equal. Mm-hmm. And the most obvious thing about an apprenticeship is a first-year apprentice, and their qualifications are much different than a fourth-year apprentice. Use the electrical trade for an example. And so there may be jobs where it's appropriate to use 15 first-year apprentices, but there may be jobs where it's not appropriate at all to use any apprentices until they're in the fourth year because of the skills that they've maintained. But the proposal does not assume that or even take into consideration that all these projects are different. A hospital project may be different than a jail project that might be different than a wastewater treatment project, for example. But please continue.
Yeah, I think and that's a good point because the pipeline of apprentices isn't equal year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4. It's at the moment it's probably very front-ended on years 1 and 2. And more experienced apprentices are probably much harder to come by. So you're right. There's just a flaw in the way of thinking where it just generalizes across sectors, which we'll get into next. But it also generalizes within what an apprentice is. Like these aren't cogs within a machine. These are people. There's safety considerations. There's other business considerations that must be met. And to force a certain amount of newer workers on a job site probably is, as we're alluding to, year 1 or year 2 apprentices is probably not ideal. Now, the sectors are obviously very different in construction. So there are sectors like road building and other civil sectors where you're dealing with a lot of operators of heavy machinery, with a lot of laborers. And in those sectors, apprenticeships are very rare. And again, that's not a flaw in the system that apprenticeships are rare. That's just how the industry has evolved over the past number of decades. So we have very safe dozer operators, backhoe operators that can get trained by a company in a shorter amount of time and get higher wages than a lot of folks going through a formal apprenticeship. So it's attractive to workers to pursue a voluntary trade just because of how easy it is, or how much easier it is to get a full wage early on. But it's up to the individual. And so that's just how the sector evolved. And the number of voluntary trades in Ontario is actually pretty much the same as every other province. We actually have more compulsory trades than most provinces, with the exception of Quebec. And so that's an issue too. So again, for businesses where there's really no registered apprentices at the moment, to compel them on a road building project to have 10 or 20% apprentices is so different than the current way of doing work. It would be highly disruptive. Also compounding the problem is in some voluntary trades like laborers, one union basically controls the flow of apprentices. And so the construction craft worker trade, which is the trade where the scope of practice is similar to what we would call a laborer. In that trade, LIUNA 183 basically has the pipeline of workers there. They have the training delivery agent status. They're the only one in the province that has the construction craft worker apprenticeship program. So the pipeline of apprentices, it's not the same for each trade, even if you wanted to ramp it up quickly. Most of them are based in the GTA. There's significant regional issues with training, even in the compulsory trades. But in the voluntary trades, it's even more problematic because you have to do the training in many cases through a union-based training center, which is problematic to a lot of our members as well as non-union workers and companies. So again, the distinction between voluntary and compulsory isn't made in this consultation. That's a flaw because the two regimes are completely different.
I want to go back a little bit to the conversation that you said, the industry has evolved, particularly the civil portion of the industry in training their workers on the job. That's what an apprenticeship is, training your workers on the job. A formal apprenticeship will include the in-class portion and will include a CFQ. But what's evolved in the road building industry, for example, over the last 100 years, is a form of apprenticeship. You'll start as a flag person, then you'll maybe move to a raker, then you'll maybe, at some point be able to jump on a small piece of equipment once that training's there. And then you can evolve to jump in a larger piece of that. That flexibility is there and that training is there. And it's kind of a moving up, as we would recognize, more on the kind of white collar side, but moving up through the flow of a workplace. So I kind of go back to, as you discuss some of the flaws in this, I guess the question is, what is this proposal trying to solve? If already the industry has found a way to train its workers and to continuously provide opportunities for their workers, for example, in road building, but in other portions too, what is this proposal trying to solve?
Well, I think, look, the government wants to increase apprenticeships, and I think they have a strong record of that. If you look at the change in the journey person to apprenticeship ratio to 1-to-1 across the board for all trades, if you look at the winding down of the Ontario College of Trades, which was, as we all know, very controversial, to Skilled Trades Ontario, which is much more promotion-based of the trades rather than regulation of the trades, there has been a marked difference in terms of how the government even communicates apprenticeship. It used to be considered kind of the last option if you weren't able to get into university, whereas the message from the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Labor, Immigration Training and Skills Development, really puts apprenticeship at the forefront. They've invested a lot in terms of promotion of the skilled trades. So the government has really, across a number of ministries, put an emphasis on apprenticeship. And I think this continues that. I think it's, for the reasons we've gone over, misaligned with the realities of construction. And I think the government should be commended for the great work they've done. Again, if you look at the apprenticeship registration numbers and completion numbers from 2018, say, to now, there has been a significant increase in apprenticeships, and they should be commended for that. But the way they're going about this now, which, based on the research we've done, there's no similar jurisdiction in Canada, that no other province at least, that compels all public sector work to have a certain component of apprentices. Again, there's flexibility there for the contractor. They're usually trying to maximize the number of apprentices on the job site, but this is kind of artificially boosting it. And as you said, on the voluntary side, as you mentioned, kind of, there's already an informal system where a worker is getting trained within a company, say, or they might switch companies, and they might start as a flag worker, as you said, and work their way up to a site supervisor or something, right? So there's an existing way of training in the voluntary side that just because you don't have a certificate doesn't mean you're less valuable as a worker. And that should be stated. But again, I understand the government's emphasis on apprenticeship, but the distinction between voluntary and compulsory really needs to be emphasized.
Yeah, as you talk about the voluntary versus compulsory, I kind of think a little bit about a conversation we had during the old Ontario College of Trades days, and some of our colleagues in the industry and contractors will remember this too, where we were speaking generally about the carpentry trade. And the idea of compulsory certifying the carpentry trade, that meant you have to have a C of Q to work as a carpenter anywhere in the province or to do carpentry work. And one of the issues that we pointed out back in the day, you'll remember this well, Stephen, was we said, that's fantastic, but in order to have an apprentice, you need to have a journey person to train that apprentice. And I think that's one of the flaws this proposal doesn't necessarily deal with as well or thinks through, because we continue to talk about the construction craft worker trade, but I think it's immensely important because of the number of craft workers there are in Ontario across all the provinces, where we're trying to, federally trying to create mobility. Now let's go back to our construction craft worker trade here in Ontario. If you were to suggest that, let's just say most road building projects are public projects, right?
Sure.
Like that's just the nature of the game in that industry. So, 90% of the road building industry is working on public projects. So 90% of that industry would be forced into some type of regime in which they would have to carry, let's just guess, 10 to 15% of the workforce as apprentices. Are there enough journey people in that trade to train to carry that amount of apprentices? And as Stephen, you did a lot of good work putting together the response to the government's consultation, and I think throughout that you did some research, and the research showed, and I don't know, I'm just going to throw out the number here. I think you said only 158 individuals in 2024 graduated with a certificate of qualification as a construction craft worker in that trade. Is that correct?
That's data that comes from Skilled Trades Ontario, so it's public data. And you're right, there's just a simple issue of arithmetic here. Not all trades are starting at the same level. So you have trades that are basically starting at, well, not zero, but close to zero. And the tens of thousands of people that are performing road work that are considered
general labor,
thank you,
construction craft worker, yeah,
is significant. And so to just compel 10 or 20% of those workers to have a registered apprenticeship status overnight, or however this gets phased in, is not reasonable. As well as, what are we trying to achieve here? Those workers are in heavily regulated industries. they're getting paid historically high rates across Ontario. And so we're like, it's kind of a solution trying to find a problem. But just the arithmetic issue that you raised, and that's not the only trade that's the issue, but it's the biggest one. And it just shows you how diverse the industry is, and you can't do something so broad and general of a requirement for a sector that's so diverse.
Yeah, I keep going back to that example that you used because I think about the enormous amount of training dollars that have been distributed to the union, the LAUNA, that is primarily training construction craft workers, and to see the result of only 158 graduating in 1 year, I think probably demonstrates the market's response and the market's wishes on this. And at some point, I think government can do as much as they can do, and the promotion of the skilled trades has been excellent. But if the market isn't responding and asking for it, that with an increase in the number of people graduating as a construction craft worker with a certificate qualification, perhaps in this case, this is one of those times where we have trust that we've built some safe roads and bridges and civil infrastructure across the province, for example, without such heavy-handedness being put into the marketplace. I'm very cognizant of our time here, but I do want to kind of move to what we're suggesting the government could do. What are some other options for the government to increase apprenticeship? Or really, I think what they're trying to get at here is they recognize that we're going to need over 100,000 skilled trade workers in the province in the next 10 years. What can the government do instead to increase our skilled trades workforce?
That's a great question because, we want to be helpful and we want to be constructive, but what we're hearing from members is very different than what this proposal is suggesting. So we are hearing constructive ideas from our members to increase apprenticeship completions and registrations. For instance, a significant issue that was worsened during the COVID-19 pandemic because of capacity issues within training facilities is the lack of in-class apprenticeship training. And this is an acute problem regionally, but it's really a problem across Ontario for voluntary and compulsory trades. On the public colleges side, which does 80% of in-class apprenticeship training in the skilled trades, that's where all our members basically have their workers do their training. On the non-union side, similar story. We're hearing there's still a lot of backlogs in that system. Now, the government is providing funding for that, but that is one of I'd say the clearest issue that the government could solve in the near term to increase apprenticeships, just more accessibility to training, more classes, more TDAs across Ontario. That would go a long way. I realize there's an investment in that, but that's, I think, the biggest thing. There's also, I think, ways the government could look at modernizing the apprenticeship system. So you talked about the number of completions in the construction craft worker trade. Again, that is a market response to the training in a way. So how does the market respond more positively in the voluntary space? You make the training more relevant. You might make it more digestible for the worker so they can move through it faster and in smaller components, still demonstrating their skill set that would demonstrate to the employer that they're able to do the work. So there's ways the government could use micro-credentialing or multi-skilling, making it easier for workers to have a number, like more than one C of Q, which is common in a lot of jurisdictions. That would go a long way. We want workers that have a number of skills. So if there's a slowdown in one sector, they can move to another more easily. So again, I think there's a lot the government could do. Procurement, obviously, we think there's barriers in the procurement system. We talk about that all the time. But the government could be focusing on a number of areas that we think we're not saying they're easy. There are investments required, but certainly there's a template there to be fixed on the training capacity side, as well as a broader conversation about how do you make apprenticeships, especially in the voluntary side, how do you make them more marketable? Because like it's great someone has a piece of paper, but how relevant is that to the employer when they're going to hire? That's a really key question, and no one's asking that question.
I just want to key in on you were speaking about multi-skilling, and I think very soon we'll have another episode of Constructive Thinking talking specifically about multi-skilling. It's the idea of when you have one tradesperson with a certificate, why not, as opposed to trying to figure out how we're going to get additional bodies, why don't we find a way to incent tradespeople to have a secondary certificate, and all of a sudden you've got one skilled tradesperson turning into two without the hand wringing of where are we going to find all these actual bodies in the next 10 years. They already exist, but why don't we just put that on steroids and find a way to incent skilled trades workers? And one of the biggest, and I say this all the time as we talk about this issue, one of the biggest things for parents as they think about their child getting into the skilled trades is to say, okay, so they're just going to be an electrician and they're going to be an electrician for life. They don't see that journey, and being able to demonstrate these options, get an additional CFQ. Here's the journey to becoming your own owner of a company with, multiple skill sets within your company. I think all of this multi-skilling idea really builds into this whole journey of, yes, I'm building Canada, I'm building Ontario. I have multiple skill sets in order to do that, and I think there's a pure incentive there for some flexibility in the industry too. Imagine the productivity that we could gain by having one person on the job site with multiple skills. But anyway, that's for another episode. But it's a good point, is that if really the end goal here, if the proposed goal and the purported, I would say, suggestion in the documents is to increase the skilled trades in Ontario, this is not the vehicle to do so. This heavy-handedness. I think there's a lot of other low-hanging fruit out there that probably would receive more market acceptance than probably the idea of suggesting exactly how many apprentices you need to have on a particular project. Stephen, sorry, I took over there, but do you have any summarizing comments? Any thoughts you want to leave the audience
I think,
with?
Look, we want to be constructive, and we're hearing a lot of the points we raised in this conversation are similar points I'm sure the government's going to be hearing from other industry groups and other companies when they're going out to consult on this. So what we're saying is not unique or different. I think they're going to hear this from a lot of different quarters in the industry.
I think it's something that once the responses are in, there will have to be a full conversation and some further thought put around this. Anyway, PCA will be, you probably have it in your inbox. If not, PCA members will have it in your inbox. You'll see our full response to the consultation in your inbox. For those that are not PCA members, industry members, please contact us. Please reach out to us. You know how to get a hold of Stephen and I. Happy to share further thoughts and provide our response to the consultation. This was fun. This is digging into a policy file like this and providing, I would say, Stephen provided some very, very thoughtful suggestions on things we could be doing as opposed to this, and I think they're worth some thought. So thank you so much, Stephen. Thanks for your time on this, and we'll talk to all of you soon again.
Look forward to it. Thank you.